Ah, all right. After much fighting and struggle. There we go, that's better. Hello once again to another discussion about comic books. This isn't a tutorial so much as my soapbox. I'm gonna stand on my soapbox and try to make a point that is about comic books and my argument for setting your comic book in a realistic setting versus an imaginary one. And I'm a big fan and lover of superhero stories, science fiction stories, fantasy stories, horror and the occult. Maybe with a little less science fiction, because that you could argue is based on reality. But you know what I mean. It's like stories that are more fanciful, that have elements of, you know, magic or an overturning of reality as we know it. Let's put it that way. And my argument for setting a comic book in a realistic setting is as follows, and it's really boring, and I really started off on the wrong foot. So let's begin differently. Okay, ready? Okay. You're making a comic book that has superheroes. Great. You're making a comic book that has magical characters. Great. You're making a comic book that has monsters, vampires, and werewolves. Great, great, great. Also great, you're making a comic book with a man with a plan and all he has is a gun. Or a kid with a plan and all he has is his guts, his courage, or lack of. I'm going to make a really short comparison to the pros and cons of either setting your story in a fantasy setting or setting it in a, I would call it a true crime realistic setting. The superhero fantasy, of course, would be like anything that pretty much has existed since the age of Superman and Batman, or the mighty Thor, or Spider-Man. Anything in the Marvel Comics, DC universe is, we all know what superheroes really are all about. Then there's the stuff that's like fantasy driven. This is an example of an indie comic that I picked up, Knight's Dominion. And then this is more what I was talking about, an argument in favor of working in this kind of genre of the true crime. Reckless with Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips. Really enjoyed the story on this one. The first point that I want to make is when you make a superhero story or a fantasy, especially if you have a story with magic in it, you have to set rules. The reader has to understand what can and can't happen with the superhero. Also, with a fantasy kind of story, the reader has to now understand the world that you've partly built. What is the kingdom? Who's in charge? Who's in power? Those are disadvantages because you're forcing your reader to do a little bit of homework to catch up to your story and to understand it. With long-running tales, long-running familiar stories that have existed for a long time, like The Wizard of Oz, maybe Lord of the Rings would be an example. People don't have to be schooled quite so much in the rules of those kinds of stories because they've existed in folklore. But a new one like this, relatively new, a few years back when I picked up this book, of course you got to start reading like who's in charge, who's in power, what kind of magic spells can be cast, and what they do to people, all of that stuff. It can be a little bit taxing when you're plowing through a fantasy story like that. And the last thing you want to do is to stop and explain things in that kind of a story. However, with a true crime kind of story and my series of Mayfield 8, it's all relying on relatable, actual, real life rules. The sun rises, the sun sets, uh, people have to get dressed, people have jobs, people drive cars. You'd be amazed at how many things in your fantasy story you have to stop and explain that you don't have to explain in a true crime or a true setting. Um, okay, that's my first point there. Is that gets a lot of stuff out of the way right at the beginning. My second point of the realistic setting is maybe a little bit more effective than the imaginary one. Is that you kind of have a better ability to surprise the reader. You can find the extraordinary in the ordinary. I keep going back to the same same three examples, and I will always will. I think till I'm 80. I talk about Breaking Bad with Bryan Cranston, Aaron Paul Oakenfold, um, Robert Odenkirk. Sorry, and they built this story about a high school chemistry teacher. Really, that was square one in the beginning, and it's not even in it's not a small town that's quaint and picturesque and quirky, and it's not like a major important metropolis either. Not a big city. It's kind of in between. It's this Albuquerque, New Mexico, and you scratch your head. It's like, wow, really? What's so extraordinary about this setting? It's pretty bland. It's pretty dull, and the character himself is kind of dull. But as he's trying to fight for his survival, you get hooked into the story as he's raising money to pay for his cancer treatment, which then draws him into the criminal underworld that, yes, lo and behold, does exist in Albuquerque, and it's close to the Mexican border, and so we have bigger stakes at hand. That's the kind of thing that, on the surface, you start with something that is quite ordinary, and just lying right below the surface are extraordinary happenings. Like in my comic book, Mayfield 8, it starts out as a simple fry cook working at a diner who is given a proposition by his friend to go on a motorcycle trip to celebrate his birthday. All he has to do is stand watch for him while he conducts some kind of a deal somewhere. He just has to stand at the door and all that. And this snowballs into something horrific for my young kid, the main character of the story, because it draws him into serious trouble with people that are out to kill him. And it's all done by happenstance. It's just like had he gone no instead of yes, or zigged instead of zagged, maybe he wouldn't be in quite so much trouble. And I think that's the power of stories like these, is that they kind of draw you into a question about yourself, reading about it. If what would you do in this case? You can slightly pull the reader into something like that in, like, say, a horror story, like a vampire story. A reader might think about, well, what would it be like if I had eternal life, but I couldn't see the light of day? That would be fatal for me. Or I have to live off of sucking the blood and basically murdering people on a regular basis for me to keep on feeling no pain, feeling full, feeling comfortable. I guess a vampire, according to Anne Rice, they can live forever, but they can't starve to death, but they can feel extreme pain, perhaps. Those might be things that a reader could be empathetic towards, but it'll take a little bit of work for them to get there. That brings me to my third point here, that the advantage of a true crime versus superhero magic or horror is that it's instantly relatable. The temptation for a lot of comic book writers who launch into superhero titles is that they want to make something that is extremely fantastic, that just creates things that just would never happen in the real life. That polish um, polish up and really bring out the most positive and the most attractive and the coolest kind of type of character that they can imagine. Um, and you kind of lose your reader a little bit as you go further and further in that direction. You're kind of making this thing to make you happy as the writer, as the creator, and the readers like kind of questioning why does this character have to have that look or that style, and eventually, it just becomes something that you kind of have a tough time connecting with your readers. Okay. Um, Versus keeping a character ordinary, um, and that they have the same tools that you and I have. Um, then it's much more relatable kind of a case. Um, so then I have a fourth point here. Um, Realistic versus a superhero. Your story doesn't get dated. We went through a phase, few maybe 20 years back or so, where vampires were all the rage. Twilight was all the rage. And then along came The Walking Dead, and it was all about zombies. And and then the Marvel comic universe came out, and even though there were a few movies that were already in circulation, but it really started to blow up with the Avengers Endgame and the Avengers Civil War and the Iron Man, Thor, all those movies, and all the streaming videos and everything, and that became the rage. Now, I think that if you were to make something that is fantastical, you do run the risk of sounding like, oh, that definitely was somebody who made that in 2026. Or, oh, that really does look like somebody made that in 1978. And I can't explain how that happens. You're really unaware that it happens. But other stories that don't rely on all the trappings of magical or mystical things, that are kind of more grounded, they do tend to stand up better as stories on their own, and they don't have that stigma of looking dated. Now, sometimes it's intentional, like you take George Lucas's movie American Graffiti. That was shot in 1972, and it was portraying the night of graduation in 1962, and on purpose trying to really accentuate the cultural touchstones of that era, like the kind of in the middle of all the surfing music, but then the classic rock and roll on the soundtrack, and the teenagers in their cars cruising up and down the streets. And he was really showcasing an actual real time thing that happened in his life. So you could say that the movie is intentionally dated to look like it belongs in 1962, even though it was shot in 1972. So there's cases where the dating of your story is intentional. And then lastly, the benefits of staying with a true crime kind of story versus the mystical superhero or fantasy story is that you find yourself you fighting with style versus substance. The style of your story is something that starts to take precedence and starts to take over everything. Like, um, it's the look of your superhero. The superhero has to be shown at midnight, or the lighting has to be just right, and and so everything has to be stylized, and it looks much more theatrical. It looks much more fake. Versus a realistic story, it's more substance. It's literally getting up and making your coffee and putting on your clothes and taking a shower, and these characters live and breathe and walk every single day like you and I. So the the material from which your story is constructed of, when it is in a realistic setting, is authentic all the way through. And with a superhero kind of story and a fantasy kind of story, um, you're giving the reader a lot of smoke and mirrors and distractions to make them forget that you're setting this in a totally made up environment. And there can be a backlash too. And as I'll add on one last tiny little bullet point to style versus substance, is that a lot of times you forget uh, what, what it is that's concrete and real in your world. You forget a few essential facts that you have to think your way through. I did a comic book once for a guy who wanted to portray a world dying, and in his world dying, there's these two women who are expert hit persons. You know, they're hit women, I guess, assassins, and they're hired by this guy. And it was very creative, very imaginative story. The guy is supposed to look like a rhino. Okay. And it's set in an alien world, again, that's dying and dry and desiccated. But these two characters go off and get a coffee before they have their meeting, so they're a few minutes late. And I thought to myself, well, okay, that they're supposed to get in a little bit of trouble, like they're not taking this guy as serious as they should by getting the coffee. But then I thought, well, where did they get the coffee from? If this is the end of the world, you know. So it's kind of a slip up there, like whoops. And that's what happens when you imagine a fantasy kind of story. You have to work double, triple, quadruple overtime to build the background, to make sure that there aren't any plot holes, or you know, like a character that suddenly can do this, but it defies the laws of physics, but then the laws of physics hold up everywhere else in your story. One example of that actually is a story I heard about J.R.R. Tolkien in Lord of the Rings, that he had Gandalf in key parts of the story in different places in Middle-earth, and he realized by doing so, Middle-earth is huge. It's larger than the continent of Europe. It's huge, okay? And for Gandalf to travel in just a few days' time over these thousands of miles, he would have to have like some kind of magical power. He is a wizard and he could teleport, perhaps, but then that would undo all of his story. When Gandalf is in he's in a dire situation with everybody else, why can't he just teleport his way out of it? So Tolkien came up with his horse, Shadowfax, that it's like one of the most amazing, fastest horses that ever lived, and it can travel. It could ride, several hundred miles in a day, and without breaking a sweat or whatever. So it's kind of a slightly magical horse, but that way, it was a very effective device for him to keep his story grounded in mostly realism with a little bit of magic, but the magic is used very sparingly. And Gandalf, he's human like you or I, and has to, if he's going to get from one place to another quicker than any person can, he's got a horse that can do that for him. So anyway, I hope that's useful for you to watch this. Thank you for watching this all the way through. And this is just my case for maybe thinking about setting your story in a realistic setting, and not immediately going to the fantastical or magical elements. Ask yourself, is there a way you could tell the same story with maybe a guy with a with a with a handheld phone with the data chip in it or something that is key to this company, or else they need to kill him to get it, versus a man who has the magic crystal, in a fantasy story. Is there a way you could retell your story in a realistic setting and still make it all work? That's something to think about. I will talk to you later. Okay.